Malcolm LaRoque was born in a small Canadian suburb where modest houses lined the narrow streets, and a mailbox always stood beside each one. His family belonged to a small African-Canadian community that, despite the lack of money and difficulties in everyday life, stuck together. All Malcolm remembered from his childhood was a warm atmosphere of caring and devotion, marred, however, by the absence of a male figure to give him advice or serve as a role model. His father disappeared when Malcolm was barely 5. His mother never revealed the details of his departure. Whenever the boy asked where his father was, she would just sigh softly. Nevertheless, she learned to work 2 jobs at the same time to pay the rent and buy everything they needed. Every day from morning to late afternoon, she was busy, leaving her young son under the care of Aunt Elise or Grandma Lauren, who lived just 2 streets away. Over time, this routine became a routine for the boy. Seeing how his mother and aunt, despite their different personalities, managed to keep the house together, he began to perceive female strength as something natural and undeniable. In his young mind, it seemed that women could provide and protect at the same time, while men, on the contrary, disappear when life gets complicated. Malcolm would often run into his grandmother's kitchen, where he would always catch the scent of spices and freshly baked bread. There, he would listen to stories about their family's African roots, the difficulties faced by Black communities in Canada, and how people managed to maintain their dignity and faith despite all the hardships. My grandmother kept saying, "The women of our family are so strong, you can't do without their support." As a child, Malcolm could not yet fully realize the depth of these words, but he kept in his heart the conviction that women's strength is an unshakable thing. Without a father to explain what it meant to be a boy or a man, Malcolm looked to the women around him for guidance. Aunt Elise, loud and determined, easily put her neighbor in his place if he listened to music too loudly at night. Grandmother Lauren, despite her age, remained the center of family life and skillfully managed everything. The mother, tired of night shifts, was ready to stand up for her son. Together they became the stronghold that is usually symbolized by the figure of a father. It is not surprising that since then he has especially appreciated women's gentleness, wisdom, and warmth. As a teenager, Malcolm realized that his confidence was largely based on the approval of adult women. At school, he often sought affection from teachers and mentors rather than from his peers. When he was 16 or 17, he finally realized that he was most attracted to experienced and mature women, as he saw them as reliable and understanding. At home, when his mother came home from her second job, barely able to keep up with the exhaustion, he tried to do the housework, but still felt that it was not enough. He longed for more serious recognition, not just approval like "well done" or "good son," but real honor. So as soon as he received his high school diploma, he decided to find a part-time job or volunteer to test himself outside of his family's usual environment. Smart and diligent, he was not without youthful appeal, and he also wanted to experience his own adulthood. Subconsciously, he imagined that it was among experienced women that he would be able to get what his father did not give him: support, advice, and guidance. However, in his adolescent fantasies, these considerations smoothly turned into more overt desires. He wanted to be not only a son in the eyes of others, but also an equal, an object of attraction, so that when he looked at an older woman, he could feel like a man. He wanted to be around confident adults, while at the same time standing out and experiencing the adrenaline of something forbidden. And it was this trait that would push Malcolm onto a dangerous path. So when he was just a few steps away from turning 18, he was convinced that he was ready for adulthood. He did have a few girls of his age among his friends, but they didn't excite him. They mostly seemed too frivolous. Instead, the very thought of a relationship with an experienced woman created an inner awe and thirst for new things. And it was then that fate seemed to give him a chance. Malcolm had never had any official volunteer experience, but one day while walking through the streets of his suburb, he came across an advertisement for volunteers at a charity center that distributed food and clothing to those in need. Why not, he thought, trying to make a difference in his usual social circle. That was the first time he stepped into the small but well-maintained facility with a discreet "Let's help together" sign on the door. The room smelled of disinfectant and fresh coffee. Volunteers in brightly colored t-shirts were bustling between the racks of supplies. Among them, one woman stood out in particular. confidence in every look, a soft but determined smile. It was Claudette James, a 50-year-old African-Canadian woman, slightly taller than the average woman, with a lush hairstyle and obvious authority. Claudette has been running this center for several years, having once experienced what it's like to be left without money and without support. When she met the new assistant, she smiled gently and asked, "What's your name?" "Malcolm," he replied, barely hiding his embarrassment. "And I'm Claudette. Nice to meet you. Would you like an orientation, or do you want to get started?" Her voice had both a friendly tone and a subtle, commanding tone. For the first 2 hours, he unloaded heavy bags of clothes and boxes of food for those living on the street. Though the work was intense, Malcolm felt a strange warmth brewing inside. He noticed Claudette glancing over at him several times as she walked around the center, as if to check on him, but also smiling in approval. When they were almost done with the load, she invited him to take a break and have a cup of tea in the cozy courtyard. Under the midday sun, on the old wooden benches, they felt for the first time that they were talking about more than just the center's business. Claudette asked him why he decided to become a volunteer, where he came from, and whether he had parents. Malcolm spoke briefly about his mother, who spends most of her time at work, and admitted that he wanted to do something useful for others. "You're very kind-hearted, young man," she said, lightly touching his arm with her fingertips, and this small touch made him feel good. Her voice, though a little low, sounded warm and caring, as if enveloping him. Then day after day he returned to the center, immersing himself deeper and deeper in the common tasks. He watched with noticeable interest as Claudette confidently managed the work processes, from food distribution and financial reporting to negotiations with donors. He saw that she often lacked assistance and was often left alone in the evenings to handle the paperwork. One day, when the other volunteers had left, Malcolm offered to help her with the computer work, and he was good at it. They were left alone in the silence of the small office. Claudette flipped through folders of invoices, while he concentrated on transferring data into a spreadsheet. But soon their work together turned into a frank conversation about life's difficulties. Malcolm admitted how he sometimes misses what he never experienced: the presence of his father, the feeling of a reliable support by his side. Claudette listened sympathetically and told him about her failed marriage. This is how mutual trust grew. When they broke for a short rest, there was a special pause in the room, not an awkward one, but one filled with a sense of anticipation of something deeper. "You're surprisingly mature for an 18-year-old, Malcolm," Claudette said, smiling. He felt a pleasant shiver go through him and looked down shyly, genuinely pleased by the praise. Week after week, he realized that with each conversation, Claudette was opening up more and more of her soul to him, as if she saw him not just as a volunteer, but as someone who understood her painful memories and fatigue. A deep emotional closeness began to form between them. One evening, wanting to thank him for his help, she invited him to dinner. Perhaps it looked desperate on her part, as she hadn't dated anyone for a long time, but she wanted to feel a little romantic spark. In the modest cafe they went to, the soft candlelight cast shadows on the table, and the muffled voices around them created a cozy atmosphere. In an elegant dress, with a glass of wine in her hand, Claudette seemed relaxed and happy. Malcolm's heart was pounding. He had never spent an evening with a woman who was more than 30 years older, but for some reason it seemed natural. Everything seemed perfect right now. That evening, after bringing her home, he stayed for tea. But that tea turned into a long conversation, an exchange of glances and light touches. When her hand touched his shoulder timidly and her eyes revealed an inner trepidation, they both felt something forbidden, yet so desirable. With a sigh, Claudette gently brushed her palm over his face and whispered, "I don't remember the last time I felt so alive." The late hour, the feeling of closeness and warmth, all of this resulted in a kiss, and then their first intimate union. For Malcolm, it was much deeper than mere physical contact. For the first time, he experienced the feeling of a truly adult relationship. And Claudette wondered how it could be that such a young man could touch her heart, which she had thought had become petrified after the divorce, so precisely. Having agreed to keep their relationship a secret because of the big age difference, they did not lose any sincerity in their relationship. For Malcolm, it was a dream come true, a woman who respects, understands, and supports him, while being his lover, mentor, and even a kind of reflection of his mother, even though he did not want to admit it. However, this idol could not last for too long, and soon something happened that he could not have foreseen. After several months of secretly seeing Claudette, Malcolm felt a new confidence in himself. It was as if he had become a full-fledged adult whose position was recognized by a grown woman. Although he still kept this affair quiet in front of his friends, he was proud of himself in his heart. Finally, he thought, real adulthood begins when your serious love is not with a girl of your age, but with a person who has gone through difficult trials herself. One day, Claudette invited him to join a large-scale charity event that was to take place in an elite suburb. It was planned to raise funds for a center and finance new programs for those who had lost their jobs. There will be people with authority and serious connections, so we need to make a great impression, she explained. Malcolm was excited to be there, even if he had to pretend to be just a volunteer. Arriving at the large exhibition hall, decorated with fresh flowers and posters with their organization's logo, they began to make the final preparations. The guests were expected to arrive in the evening, but for now, several people were tidying up the tables and checking the equipment. Claudette was wearing an elegant formal suit, and Malcolm wore a shirt and dark pants to look on the level. As the first visitors arrived, businessmen, politicians, journalists, he immediately noticed one woman, Daniela Robertson, high heels and elite business suit, a haughty and demanding look. It seemed that Daniela felt like the owner of the place. It was rumored that she owned several consulting companies and was famous for her ability to buy up competitors. But in her private life, she was less lucky. It was said that she and her husband had long since cooled off, and he often ran away abroad. Claudette, having noticed Daniela, gathered her courage to withstand the inevitable contact. They had a somewhat tense episode earlier. A few years ago, Daniela refused to donate a large sum of money, considering the project too weak at the time. At the same time, she was extremely helpful when it came to large financial partners. So Claudette composed herself and went over to say hello, intending to make another attempt to establish a business relationship. Malcolm, meanwhile, was talking to a group of volunteers, but he couldn't take his eyes off Daniela as soon as she appeared. Tall, with a slender posture and an elaborate hairstyle that gave her a special confidence, as well as expensive jewelry that emphasized her high status, she struck him immediately. There was a certain authority and strength about her that was completely different from Claudette's warm, caring nature. If Claudette was like a gentle blanket, Daniela seemed like a bright flame. While Claudette exchanged short business-like phrases with Daniela, Malcolm shyly approached. Smiling, Claudette called him one of the most reliable young volunteers. Daniela looked him over, appreciating his good looks and the way he carried himself, as if she could see right away that this boy had potential. She was used to older businessmen, but here was a young man full of energy and perhaps naive sincerity. "It's nice to meet you, Malcolm. I really hope you will contribute to the common cause today, too," she said with a subtle smile, extending her hand. He noticed how the subtle scent of her expensive perfume mingled with the handshake. She looked at him intently, as if she was trying to see into his very soul. He blushed for a moment, feeling his heart beat rapidly. After a short acquaintance, Daniela switched to talking to other guests, but he was left with a strange impression and a desire to know more about her. She was not like Claudette, more self-confident, bright, immersed in luxury. And this intrigued him. When the official part of the evening came to an end, the guests gradually left. Daniela stopped him. "I saw you working with Claudette. You're quite talented. I'd like to discuss something in more detail, but it's too crowded here. Why don't we find a quiet place and have a coffee?" For Malcolm, it sounded like a challenge or a hint of a special opportunity. At the same moment, he remembered Claudette's possible jealousy, but she was busy with other visitors. So he nodded cautiously. "Sure, I'd be happy to help." They retired to a cozy lounge area where only a few other guests were already staying. Under the soft light and with the soothing murmur of a fountain in the corner, Daniela started talking about her plans for the future. "If you are currently looking for your path after school," she said, "there are many internship programs at my companies. You are still young, so you can choose." Her voice sounded confident, even slightly predatory, and Malcolm felt this atmosphere begin to captivate him. "I haven't really decided what I want to do yet," he admitted, "but I like the feeling that I'm making a difference." It is possible that I will go into management or maybe choose something else. Sometimes you just want freedom. Freedom is a magical word, Daniela replied dreamily. I can't live without it either. But sometimes we become hostages to circumstances and life goes on. So you have to be able to take everything you want from it while you have the chance. She looked him straight in the eye, and he felt his pulse quicken again. It seemed that she had no reason to be afraid of risk. Her impeccably applied makeup, sparkling earrings, and precious ring on her ring finger, although it was rumored that she was divorced or separated from her husband, made her even more mysterious and attractive. A few minutes later, they said goodbye, but before they did, Daniela handed him a business card with the words, "Call me, I don't bite," and her own phone number. It took him by surprise. He felt as if he was entering a new territory where the attractive and wealthy Daniela made her own rules. On the way home, Malcolm tried to keep a smile on his face as Claudette praised him for his diligence. However, a real storm was raging in his heart. What to do with the fact that Daniela was just as intrigued by him? The very next morning, he sent her a message without hesitation. "Hi, it's Malcolm. How are you feeling?" The answer came instantly. "Shall we meet tonight at 7 p.m. at the Chateau Luxe?" He couldn't refuse. The offer sounded too tempting. So he found himself in an exquisite restaurant with snow-white tablecloths and waiters who were almost whispering to customers. Daniela sat at the table like a queen, taking a quick glance at his modest but neat clothes. She did not hesitate to order expensive wine and food without worrying about the price, as she was obviously used to it. At first, the conversation centered on education and work, but later it turned to more personal topics. Daniela admitted that she had not felt passionate about her husband for a long time. "My husband is doing his own thing, and I lack vivid impressions. You, Malcolm, seem to me to be someone with whom I can do absolutely crazy things." He hesitated between his loyalty to Claudette and his desire to try new experiences. But the attention Daniela was giving him was too tempting to refuse. After a few glasses of wine, Daniela lightly touched his knee under the table. This subtle movement made his heart flutter, as if warning him of the dangerous road he was entering. But he also had a desire to prove that he was capable of holding the interest of such a woman. As they set off in her luxurious car, the interior of which smelled of Daniela's leather and perfume, the evening air seemed like a cool backdrop for this adventure. Outside his house, she leaned down and kissed him, clearly showing that she wanted more. It was a kiss of palpable boldness and dominance, not at all like the tenderness he had known before. It had a special flavor of forbidden excitement. From then on, his double life began, with two women awakening different emotions in him. Claudette gave him warmth, confidential communication, and true intimacy, while Daniela beckoned with risk, luxury, and bold passion. On the one hand, he was worried about how to hide these relationships from each other, and on the other hand, he was glad that neither of them suspected his affairs. So he met Daniela more and more often, either in hotels or in apartments owned by her or her company. And these were no longer just friendly get-togethers. "Today you are all mine," she said, smiling, taking him to yet another luxurious apartment with an incredible view. With each such date, he dived deeper into the tempting thought that he could become a king for both of them. But at the same time, he was afraid that Claudette would find out, and he felt like a traitor to her, since she had confided in him, shared her most intimate secrets, and was his true friend and lover at the same time. "But I'm still so young," he reassured himself. "I have to try everything," stubbornly believing in his own impunity. Meanwhile, Daniela was becoming more and more demanding. When he couldn't make it on a certain Tuesday because he had already promised to spend the evening with Claudette, she would not hold back her anger. She would abruptly hang up on him or send him insulting messages. And then he would have to lie, saying he was sick or urgently helping his mother, just to please Daniela. This is how he balanced Claudette's warmth of spirit and Daniela's power-hungry passion, not even realizing how dangerous this situation would be if they ever met. Malcolm thought that their circles were too different, so that an accidental intersection was out of the question. But fate had a plan of its own. As time went on, his lies grew, as he had to reconcile the contradictions in his own schedule. Claudette would call him to volunteer events and home dinners, or Daniela would suddenly call with an order. "Come over now. I have a free evening, and I want to see you." At first, he made lighthearted excuses for Claudette. He had to visit his mother or take care of family business. She sincerely believed him because she knew him to be a doting son. However, over time, these explanations became completely unconvincing. Claudette felt that the trust between them was cracking. At night, they could no longer discuss things as they had before, because Malcolm either left early or canceled the meeting on false pretenses. At the same time, Daniela showed her own jealousy, especially when she did not receive his consent to meet at the time she needed. Accustomed to absolute obedience in her company, she demanded the same attitude from Malcolm. If he said he couldn't make it because he had already given his word to someone else, Daniela would get furious, having passionate arguments on the phone or sending angry texts with ultimatums. I don't take no for an answer. From then on, Malcolm's life became a chain of cunning tricks to keep both Claudette and Daniela's affections at the same time. His ego was warmed by the fact that two mature and successful women were competing for him, but his anxiety that one of them would find out about the other was also growing rapidly. At night, he woke up in a cold sweat more than once, thinking, what if the secret is revealed? And his heart was pounding. Once, when Claudette invited him to a home-cooked dinner, he arrived late, explaining that he was caught in a traffic jam. In fact, he had spent the entire evening with Daniela at a fancy spa and had barely escaped. Claudette cooked a delicious soup and pie, trying to create the family comfort she herself lacked. While eating, she suddenly threw a question in his direction. Are you really in no hurry? You look so nervous. He replied that he was tired and quickly changed the subject, but her eyes were already distrustful. Meanwhile, Daniela, noticing the inconsistency in his schedule, began to check it sneakily. She could write at 8 in the evening, "Hi, how are you?" and then ask a clarifying question. "Where are you now?" If he avoided specifics, she would ask his friends if he had been seen with someone else. She had no idea that Claudette existed, but she felt that Malcolm had other things to do that diverted his attention. The young man's little mistakes became more and more obvious. For example, once he forgot an expensive watch given to him by Daniela in his backpack, and Claudette came across it while cleaning up. The elegant look and price were clearly beyond the means of an 18-year-old boy from a poor family. She asked, "Where did this thing come from?" He was embarrassed and joked that he had won it in a raffle and then hastily hid the watch. Another time, Daniela noticed the remnants of an ink drawing on his palm, a small heart with the letters K, a funny symbol Claudette had once drawn. Malcolm replied that it was fooling around with friends, but Daniela smiled wryly and murmured, "Okay, let's see what happens next." Over the course of several weeks or months, this moral pressure intensified to the point where Malcolm barely slept, beating himself up for playing this double game. But at the same time, he couldn't give up on either woman because he felt simultaneously fascinated by them. Claudette was his emotional support, and Daniela was a source of thrills and precious gifts. He imagined that stopping would mean losing the whole world. By this time, both women had already moved beyond mere flirtation. Each was attached to him in her own way. Claudette even thought about introducing him to her family later, and Daniela considered the option of legally formalizing the relationship when she settled the formalities of the divorce. And when jealousy began to eat away at their feelings, it turned out to be the detonator for the upcoming explosion. The discovery of the truth happened quite by accident, but this coincidence turned out to be fatal. Claudette was planning to surprise Malcolm with a cozy dinner with wine, and perhaps tell him that she was ready to help him move if he decided to expand his horizons. She was aware that he had been canceling meetings lately, and she wanted to strengthen their bond. That very evening, however, he had an appointment with Daniela at her luxury apartment. Unsuspectingly, Claudette instructed one of her volunteers to tell Malcolm to come to the center's office at 7 p.m., citing an urgent matter. In her secret plans, she wanted to take him to her home. However, the volunteer inadvertently sent a message to another number in the young man's phone, indicating the exact place and time of the meeting with Daniela. This created a strange situation. Claudette now had an address, but she had no idea what kind of place it was. When Claudette saw a suspicious text hinting at a special evening handsome that accidentally came across her phone on the volunteer's phone, she felt uneasy. At first, she tried to calm down, but an inexplicable premonition overcame her doubts, and she decided to go and see for herself what kind of special date was waiting for him. At 7 p.m., she arrived at the address, an upscale residential complex with a concierge, carpeted lobby, and exquisite interior design. Claudette was confused for a moment. What was Malcolm doing here? Who had neither wealth nor contacts in such circles? But while she was trying to collect her thoughts, she saw a familiar face in the glare of the glass door. It was Malcolm, well-dressed, walking hand in hand with a woman carrying expensive furs. It was Daniela. Claudette was taken aback, having managed to hide behind a column so as not to be noticed. They seemed to be acting like a couple, exchanging smiles, looking carefree, as if enchanted by the luxury around them. Daniela was smiling too, looking at him as if he belonged to her completely. Claudette's heart clenched with a sharp pain. The one who had so sincerely promised her love and to whom she had opened her soul was a liar. Resentment and disappointment swept over her, and everything inside her was literally boiling. She could hardly contain herself from doing something stupid. Not knowing what to do, Claudette waited until they were out of sight and in the elevator. Then she went to the receptionist and explained, "Excuse me, I'm looking for my nephew. He just came up with Mrs. Robertson. Could you tell me the floor?" The concierge looked at her with disbelief but told her the floor. 12th floor, apartment 867. Gathering her courage, she took the same elevator. She still hoped that maybe it was some kind of business issue or misunderstanding. But as she stood at door number 1207, she heard Daniela's laughter and the sound of Malcolm's voice through the door. The temptation to knock and cause a scandal was extremely strong. She knocked and waited in silence for a few seconds. Daniela opened the door, visibly surprised. "Claudette, why are you here?" "That's for you to ask," Claudette replied in a cold voice. Behind Daniela in the room, Malcolm could see the frightened look on Malcolm's face, and he immediately realized that the moment of truth had arrived. Do you know each other?" he tried to say, looking for some line of defense. But the expressions on the two women's faces indicated that any words were unnecessary. Claudette looked at him with a mixture of pain and anger. "So I'm the one you've been cheating on then?" The three of them gathered in the living room of the luxurious apartment, an atmosphere that had recently been romantic and carefree, but now resembled a powder keg ready to explode. Daniela, realizing that her opponent was the woman from the charity center, did not get confused, but spoke sharply. "So you are the one to whom he gives part of his time? And you didn't realize that Malcolm was so fussy between the two? Though perhaps it is not surprising." Claudette, trembling with rage and resentment, looked at Malcolm in confusion. "Why? What was all that lying about? I thought we were in true love." He felt cornered, wanted to explain that he hadn't meant to hurt her, that it was an accident, but Daniela stood between them, looking down at Claudette. "He's old enough to choose who he wants to be with. Do you think he'd rather sit in your humble home than enjoy all I have to offer?" Every word she said only added fuel to the fire. Claudette, who was accustomed to keeping herself in check, was losing her temper. "How dare you speak like that?" She seemed about to burst into tears or explode with even more anger. Malcolm tried to separate them with his hands. "Please stop. I meant no harm. I was just confused." However, both women became even more enraged by his excuses. Daniela abruptly threw his hand away and leaned toward Claudette and hissed, "Understand, if you couldn't keep him, don't be surprised that he chose me. I have it all. Money, opportunities, insane passion." "Shut up," Claudette exclaimed. "I loved him sincerely, and you just play with him like a toy." A wave of shouting and accusations erupted in the room. Malcolm rushed between them, trying in vain to calm the quarrel, feeling his heart beating almost in his throat. It seemed like a little more, and everything would fall apart. "Malcolm, tell her the truth," Daniela said loudly, grabbing him by the collar. "Admit that you really want to be with me, not that pathetic volunteer." Claudette also rushed over to them, trying to pull Daniela away from the boy. "Get away! Don't you dare run his life like it's your business." In this chaos, he broke down in a scream. "Stop! I didn't want this ending. I loved both of you, Claudette, and you, Daniela. I'm sorry." The admission that he felt love for both of them at the same time sounded like an explosion. It confirmed the worst suspicions. He was really playing on two fronts. In the midst of a quarrel, the unthinkable happened. Daniela suddenly grabbed a fruit knife from the table, which they had recently used to cut cheese or fruit, preparing a wine and cheese party. Her eyes flashed with insane jealousy and a tireless thirst for power. "You're not going to play with me, boy." Malcolm turned pale with fear and tried to retreat, but she was ahead of him, striking him with a swift blow. Claudette tried desperately to intercept Daniela's hand, but she didn't have time. The blade pierced Malcolm's side, and he groaned, staring dazedly into space before a strangled scream escaped his chest. "What have you done?" Claudette cried out, rushing to the young man and trying to clamp the wound to stop the blood. Daniela, as if recovering from shock, did not let go of the knife, but quickly realized that holding it in her hand meant that she was implicated. Seeing Claudette chaotically trying to stop the blood, she slipped the handle to her with a sly movement. In her confusion and tears, Claudette grabbed it without realizing what she was doing. Now it looked as if she was the criminal. Daniela exclaimed loudly, "Oh my God, she stabbed him!" Malcolm was paralyzed with pain, and blood was flowing rapidly from the cut. His eyes, full of anguish, met Claudette's in a silent plea for rescue, or at least forgiveness. But his screaming drowned out any words. He convulsed and collapsed a moment later. Realizing that he was dying, Claudette broke down screaming, begging for an ambulance, but the phone was far away, and Daniela had already grabbed it to dial the police first. Her voice on the phone was telling, "Help! A woman has stabbed a guy!" Before the paramedics arrived, Malcolm stopped breathing in Claudette's arms. Everything froze for her as she realized that life was leaving his body. Meanwhile, Daniela acted in cold blood, pretending to be a frightened witness, but clearly kept the situation under control. When the police and paramedics finally arrived, it looked as if Claudette had indeed been the attacker. She was covered in blood, holding a knife. Daniela, sobbing, claimed that the volunteer had broken in out of jealousy and stabbed her to death. Claudette just kept repeating, "It wasn't me. She. But in a state of panic shock, she could not prove anything. The police took both of them away, but Daniela was quickly released as an eyewitness who tried to prevent a tragedy. Claudette, on the other hand, was charged with murder, as all the initial evidence pointed to her. The news of the brutal death of 18-year-old Malcolm LaRocque, allegedly at the hands of a 50-year-old woman, spread instantly through the Canadian media. Newspaper headlines were full of phrases like "love triangle that ended in a stabbing," and television channels competed in commentary on the scandalous story of an adult volunteer at a charity center who was rumored to have stabbed her young lover to death. Claudette James's name was everywhere, and her photos from numerous charity events became a symbol of this tragic incident. Most observers did not know that behind the scenes, everything was surprisingly quickly resolved in favor of Daniela Robertson. Using her connections and considerable influence, she acted until Claudette, shocked and in custody, was unable to fight. Daniela's lawyers soon reached the investigation, provided the necessary information, and assured them that their client was a respected businesswoman who happened to be a witness and almost became a victim herself. Claudette got a free lawyer because she had no money for high-end legal assistance. He tried to get to the bottom of the case, but without convincing evidence against Daniela, it seemed hopeless. Claudette's prints were mostly on the knife blade, and Daniela's footprints could be explained by the fact that she was allegedly trying to prevent a tragedy. So there was only one official version. Claudette, driven by jealousy, committed the attack, and Daniela was just a forced witness. While in the detention center, Claudette felt broken. She could neither sleep peacefully nor stop repeating desperately that Daniela had stabbed Malcolm. But who would believe the woman next to whom the body and bloody knife were found? Under the burden of accusations and public condemnation, her psychological state deteriorated further. The newspapers portrayed her as a mad lover who could not stand the rivalry. Claudette's friends and colleagues at the charity center tried to help by filing various petitions. However, it looked hopeless when Daniela had financial resources and connections on her side. Claudette's defense lawyer explained that the case could only be won if there was irrefutable evidence, such as a video or a witness, that would prove that Daniela was the culprit. So far, this has not happened. Some journalists, suspecting that not everything was transparent in the story, tried to get to the bottom of the facts. But Daniela anticipated their steps. She had leverage over media channels, made donations, or invested in certain media projects, directing public opinion in the right direction. Viewers relished the sensationalized story of fatal love with an age difference, where Claudette was portrayed as an unbalanced, jealous woman, and Malcolm as a victim who fell under the attack of a destructive passion. Malcolm's family was left in confusion and despair. The young man's mother, who had no connections or opportunities of her own, was a grief-stricken woman who watched in horror as society simultaneously condemned both her son, who had gotten into relationships with adult women, and Claudette's official killer. The mother doubted that the truth would ever come to the surface and felt only indescribable pain for the loss of her young life. When the court hearings began, many journalists came to the courtroom. The prosecutor, describing the love triangle, showed photos of Malcolm and Claudette together. Her alleged correspondence was displayed on the screen, where notes of jealousy towards some other woman could be traced. All of this, according to the investigation, confirmed the version. Claudette could have decided to commit murder while in a state of dangerous feelings. Daniela acted as a key witness. She told about the tragic moment. "I heard them arguing. He was screaming. I noticed Claudette was holding a knife," she said, as if about to cry. "I tried to intervene, but it was too late." This dramatic way of speaking swayed public opinion in her favor. Claudette responded by saying that this was not the case at all, that it was Daniela who struck Malcolm, and that she was only trying to save him. However, could they believe this if her fingerprints were mostly on the knife? The judge and the jury saw only an insecure woman who had no proof of her case. In the end, the charge was murder. Although it could have been qualified as second or third degree, the point remained the same. Claudette was going to prison for a long time. She burst into tears in the courtroom, screaming about the injustice. Daniela stood nearby, holding herself proudly, and photographers kept clicking their cameras, capturing the last act of the tragedy. For society, the denouement was obvious. A mature woman did not share a young lover, so she organized a bloody massacre. Although city gossip discussed this strange story of a young man's death due to jealousy and deception for a long time, public attention quickly turned to other scandals. Claudette was sent to a women's correctional facility. Her usual life, modest housing, volunteer work, friends from the charity sector, was a thing of the past. At first, she hoped that there would be an appeal, or that Daniela would be tormented by her conscience and confess to the real events. However, Daniela's lawyers made every effort to cover up any trace of their client's real involvement. In prison, Claudette withdrew into herself. Her days became monotonous, getting up, working, and taking short walks behind the barbed wire. Deep down, she prayed that one day the injustice would be revealed. But time passed and nothing changed. Meanwhile, Daniela, having been cleared of all charges, returned to her usual luxurious life. Her husband had been abroad for a long time, and their divorce was actually finalized. She could now live openly as she wished. But in the dead of night, when she found herself alone in her expensive apartment, she was sometimes haunted by memories of the moment when the blade cut into Malcolm's body and his eyes were filled with horror and pain. Sometimes she would wake up in a cold sweat, seeing his face covered in blood again in her mind. She tried to forget herself in her travels, mindless shopping, and fleeting relationships with different men. But anxiety gradually gnawed at her from the inside. It hardly showed on the outside. Daniela continued to be a successful businesswoman, impeccable in everything. But as soon as she heard someone mention Malcolm, she broke out in a cold sweat. She became irritable and increasingly took sleeping pills and sedatives. Meanwhile, Malcolm's family and close friends did not forget him. His mother arranged a small memorial at the gravesite where she brought flowers every Sunday to remember his kindness and young dreams. "He was always too sensitive for this cruel world," she repeated, feeling powerless that she could not save her son. Later, the passions in the city subsided, although rumors about this age triangle still surfaced in some places. Some residents sympathized with Claudette, suspecting that there was something hidden in the story, but without real evidence. Their suspicions remained at the level of talk and gossip. Local media sometimes ran articles saying, "Is Claudette really a murderer?" But no further investigation was able to establish any concrete facts. It seemed to be a vicious circle. Daniela, having influence, was silent. Claudette was behind bars. In fact, Daniela could be said to have won this battle, but she never found inner peace. The feeling that she had taken the life of a young man and framed another woman prevented her from enjoying the victory fully. She would occasionally visit a psychologist, talking about constant anxiety and insomnia, although she would not reveal the real cause. In a quiet suburb where Malcolm used to walk, friends painted his portrait on the wall of a house with the words "Forever 18." This picture became a sign of memory of a lost life. School friends brought flowers there every year on the anniversary of his tragic death. Claudette tried to file appeals over time, collecting signatures, looking for new evidence to prove her innocence and Daniela's insidious role. However, the lawyers threw up their hands, complaining about the lack of convincing evidence and the threads that had been tied up. So the ending remained bitter and unfair. Malcolm LaRoque paid with his life for his parallel relationships, which were fueled by a lack of parental support and his own desire for adult experience. Claudette James ended up in prison, labeled a murderer, even though she sincerely loved him and could not wish for his death. Daniela Robertson, a powerful and wealthy woman with a tendency to explosive aggression, ended her boyfriend's life in a fit of passion and used money and connections to avoid punishment. This became a sad story of a Canadian suburb, about jealousy, betrayal, the power of money and the unjustified risks of relationships with a significant age difference. As time went on, it became only more obvious how manipulation and influence can hide the truth, and how young sincerity can fall into the trap of cruelty and meanness. Thus, in a seemingly peaceful society with friendly neighbors, a tragedy with a bloody ending occurred. And as often happens in reality, the winner is the one who has more resources and hides his crimes under the armor of influence and power.